My name is Mira Hart. If you'd asked me months before what my life looked like, I would have drawn you a neat little map. A modest apartment in a city that smelled of roasted coffee and exhaust. A job I loved and hated in equal measure. A family that, despite the usual tensions, showed up at birthdays and holiday dinners with bottles of something expensive. I would have included in the corner the mansion on the hill where my parents lived, the place people joked about because it looked like a set from an old movie. All stone and ivy and windows that always seemed to glow. I would not have included the scene that actually played out on that cold. Then Christmas Eve, my mother and father swinging open their great doors and launching my only suitcase onto the marble steps as if it were a final gag in some cruel play. My sister stood behind them, Vera. But always V, when she wanted it to be sharper arms folded, expression smug. The sort of look that says you own the moral high ground, even when you've just stomped on it. She made a small show of amusement. "Let's see how you manage now, Myra," she said. Like, it was a test and I'd failed spectacularly. I hauled that single suitcase through a fog. That was so heavy it felt like the world had been painted in gray. No cash on me, no car keys. Nothing that signaled stability except the long wool coat wrapped around me, the only warm thing I'd been allowed to keep. The gated community's hedges rose tall and smug, and every house I passed glowed with warmth and laughter as if I'd been exiled to a kingdom that didn't allow mercy. I didn't have a plan. I had a numbness so steady that the shiver in my teeth seemed almost polite. I walked until I couldn't feel my toes. I walked until my legs found an iron bench under a flickering lamp in the small park beside the old stone church, the place I had once come with my parents for a winter concert when the world felt wide and anything seemed possible. I sat down hard, the bench biting through my coat, the suitcase a small, stubborn island beside me. My tears froze in little constellations on my cheeks. That was when she appeared. An elderly woman. No shoes, her feet swollen in a blue-purple that made my stomach drop. Silver hair blew in the wind like clouds. Her coat was threadbare, her fingers thin and trembling. She looked as if the cold had already decided to live inside her. "Do you know if any shelters have room tonight?" she asked, voice paper thin from the cold. I wanted to say something like, "I'm sorry," or I don't know, but both sounded brittle. I understood then without moral lectures, without thinking that she had less than I did, and I couldn't keep pretending my suffering was the only kind that deserved space. I stood, peeled off the one thing that was keeping my chest from being a block of ice, and laid it across her shoulders. Her hands took mine, and for a minute the bench and the fog, and even the suitcase at my feet dissolved into the press of palms and the warmth of another human being. "Kindness like that," she murmured, holding my hands and searching my face with eyes that were sharper than they had any right to be, "is rarer than a flawless gem." She rose, gave me a small nod and walked away into the haze. She looked so frail that for a second, I thought she might dissolve into the mist. Later, after I convinced myself the moment hadn't been real, after I sat in a grimy motel room and applied for jobs that paid enough to cover bus fare, an entire convoy of black cars arrived like a scene from a film. 19 identical sedans rolled to a quiet halt and their doors opened with the precision of choreography. The same woman stepped from the middle car, but now she was the opposite of what I'd seen. An old world presence in a long cashmere coat, her hair swept into a neat knot, shoes that could have been made for royalty glittering faintly, diamonds winking at the light on her wrist. She smiled at me as if she had been waiting, and she said only one sentence. "I've been watching you for a while. I know what you are." Everything before that, my day, my week, the abrupt email at 10 a.m. telling me my position at the advertising agency no longer existed collapsed into a single thread that linked to that bench and that coat and that woman's eyes. Morning had been ordinary in the bleak ways modern endings often are. A terse email from Human Resources, a Zoom call that explained things in euphemisms. A desk half emptied into a brown paper box. I'd shoveled a limp succulent and a handful of pens into the passenger seat of my battered Civic and driven south toward the place. I still called home by habit more than love. It was a drive I knew 32 miles. 47 minutes if traffic decided to be merciful, but no. GPS could reroute the fact that I had been let go from the thing I'd built my adult identity around. I'd called my mother from the parking garage, voice tight with that brutal optimism people use to avoid being a burden. "Can I crash for a couple of weeks?" I asked. She said dinner was at 7 and hung up. I took that as a small, final push toward the door. Inside their house, it's harder to find words for a house like that. Estate seems pale. Imagine stepping through doors that are as heavy as customs, into an air perfumed with white orchids, and a tree so tall it should have its own security guard. Waiters in tuxes arrange plates as if setting a chessboard. My father, Gideon Hart, unstoppered a bottle of bubbly like he had an agreement with time not to let ordinary moments derail his routine. My mother, Evelyn, was fastening a new strand of pearls, and she looked as if she'd been painted into existence by a woman with impeccable taste. My sister, V27 and wearing a red dress that seemed to have been tailored to scandalize. Sunlight twirled in a way that made the diamond on her finger perform for the room. Behind her, a man I used to love stood with an arm around her waist, smiling a smile I recognized from the day he told me with clinical tenderness that it was not the right time for us to be together. I dropped my keys into a ceramic bowl by the door and gave a small, automatic laugh. "Rough day," I said. As if a phrase could bandage the hollow where stability had been, Vera spun on her heel and gave the room a show. "Again?" She gasped, loudly enough for the caterers to hear. "Third job in 4 years, right?" She looked at my mother like she was reading a cue card. Remember when she was let go from that startup? Not a culture fit. My face burned. My father still hadn't looked up from his champagne. This was a mass layoff, I told them. The whole creative team was let go. It wasn't, "Oh, but Dorian just closed a Series A," Vera cut in, flashing the ring. 28 million. Pre-money valuation. The investors adore him. Dorian gave me that same half-smile he'd offered the night he said, "It's not you. It's timing," like those words were supposed to be a balm. Then my father set his glass down and said, "Mira, we need to speak." His voice had the cool detachment of a judge about to hand down a sentence. He told me, very plainly, that he had amended the family trust. $38 million in assets had been moved into Vera's name. Irrevocable, filed with their lawyer, notarized, sealed. He told me I was 32 and capable, that it was time for me to stand on my own 2 feet. My mother added that they could no longer finance a lifestyle that didn't produce results. I can still see the tableau, me with my mouth open. My sister recording with her phone. "Gold," she said. "Digital gold, you guys. Watch this. 20 minutes to pack. No discourse, no negotiation. Security would let me in tomorrow," they said, as if they were explaining how the thermostat worked. For everything else, I would need an appointment. I moved through the house like one of its paintings, a little disconnected, admired and dismissed by those who had nothing more important to do. I took only the old duffel I'd had since college and stuffed in jeans, a few sweaters, my laptop, everything else photos, diplomas, the life I had looked to as an anchor stayed. I walked back through the doors and the fog. Outside was a curtain that cooled my skin fast. Vera leaned through and called, "Merry Christmas, Mira," with syrupy sweetness. "Don't freeze." The door closed. The house's alarm chirped. It was as if the walls had an eyelid that had been lowered on me. I stood on the marble steps like a diorama in a museum that had suddenly decided I didn't belong. A suitcase at my feet, the only coat I had left wrapped around me, and the cold that made every breath a small negotiation. I tried to make myself feel anything other than numb. The truth is that, for a little while, I simply didn't know which part of me had been most damaged, the part that believed in my family or the part that had built a life out of doing the right things. I walked until the pavement grew unknown again, until the lights that marked a life of privilege were just pinpricks far behind. The town stretched its Christmas glow like a lie, and my hands became strangers to the world. At some point, I ended up in front of the old church where, years ago, we'd sat for candlelight services. There was an iron bench beneath a lamp that flickered as if it were uncertain whether to keep the light on for. Someone who had just been abandoned. That's where the thin woman found me. She shuffled toward my bench, with bare feet and a bowl of a voice that seemed to have been hollowed out by wind and poor broth. "Do you know if the shelters are open?" she asked. "I've been walking from." She named a town I'd never heard of. Her feet were down a polite distance away that made my hands ache to help. For the first time, I was ashamed of my own self-pity. She had less than I did, and she still had the manner of someone who would ask for what she needed rather than take it. I stood, stripped my coat, and wrapped it over her shoulders. She closed her eyes. She took my hands and squeezed like someone who was reminding herself that warmth still existed. "What's your name, child?" she asked, and when I said Mira, she repeated it as if tasting it for luck. She held my gaze in a way that made distance impossible. For a long, dizzying moment, we were the same human being, two people in the world without a room to call our own. Then she rose with an odd steadiness and walked into the fog. She didn't look back, and I couldn't call out because my voice had turned into glass. That act of giving away the only thing keeping me warm was the strangest cure for grief. It didn't erase the stinging humiliation of being disinherited in the foyer of my childhood, but it blurred the edges. Somehow it made space for something else, an odd lightness. The sensation of having done the one unselfish thing left to do when life had taken everything else. Later, in a motel room that smelled of pine cleaner and old cigarettes, I stared at the glow of my phone and sent resumes into the void. I watched job sites until my eyes grew square. I tried not to panic. In the hours that blend into the kind of memory best described as infinite waiting, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Mira Hart?" the woman asked, voice crisp, but with a Salton Sea rhythm I couldn't place. "My name is June Cartwright. I'm calling on behalf of Madame Seraphine Bellamy. She'd like to meet you tonight." I thought it was a prank. I must have laughed out loud because the woman on the other end paused and then said evenly, "The car is waiting downstairs. Please come." I looked through the motel peephole. 19 black sedans lined the lot like an offensive formation. A man in a plain coat stepped out and opened the lead car. The back door swung open on its own. I grabbed my keys, put on the same jeans and hoodie I'd slept in for 2 nights, and descended to the parking lot as if sleepwalking. She was waiting in the middle car. The woman from the bench, the one I'd given my coat to, stood with an elegance that seemed unfair cashmere wrapped around her like a second skin, heels that made her height a part of her presence. She looked at me with a little smile, something close to mischief. "Mira," she said. "Come." We drove away from the motel, away from the fog of my little life, until the trees closed like curtains and the road became a secret. The gates opened to an old house stone and lidded glass and a lawn that kept its own hours. Inside, the scent of cedar and roses breathed like a welcome. She offered me tea and a sofa, so plush my jeans made an offensive sound against the fabric. "My name is Seraphine Bellamy," she said, voice as formal as an invitation. "My late husband built a business. I spent a lifetime learning how to undo the cruelties of a czar and capital. After he died, I turned our private company into a foundation. We own and fund buildings and programs across the country." She told me numbers that didn't mean anything to me. Square footage, millions spent, strategies deployed. It was all abstract until she leaned forward and said something that made my mouth go dry. Every Christmas Eve, for decades, she had dressed herself in rags and walked through the streets to find someone who still had a heart when the cameras weren't watching. Most years she went home disappointed. "This year," she said, "I found you." She told me she'd had a team watching for a little while. They'd seen me check into that motel with cash, eat vending machine food, apply to 50 jobs and sit and cry in the shower because I had no plans and only the remnant decency of having given my coat away. They saw that I did not boast about the small kindness I'd offered, and that I never asked questions about the woman I had warmed. "You are the first person in 15 years," she said quietly, "who walked into the cold and gave away the last thing keeping them alive without expecting anything in return." And there it was. She offered shelter, a salary, a 5-year apprenticeship to learn her foundation properly. If I could prove I was what she thought I was, the foundation would be mine. Not as a gift, but as a responsibility. I remember asking one small word, "Why?" She answered like someone putting the truth into her own mouth to keep from echoing a memory. "I know what it feels like to be turned out." I was 29 when my father closed the door on me. I promised myself that if I ever had power, I would make sure that someone who chose goodness when no one was watching would not be left in the cold. She extended her hand. "So, Myra Hart, will you come home with me?" I moved into the east wing of that house the following week. My new bedroom was an embarrassment of windows and fabric and quiet. The roses outside smelled like something that should be labeled permission. June, the woman who took numbers and schedules and made them behave, handed me a binder the thickness of a small law book and said, "Welcome to boot camp." The apprenticeship was brutal. 6 a.m. runs around the lake with a former Navy physical trainer. Breakfast that felt like an exam. Then 9 to 6 workdays where I sat in the shadow of wealth and watched money argue with morality. I learned to read tax forms, grant applications, and balance sheets until the numbers read like prose. I learned how to make decisions that would not simply feel good, but would actually stand. When the press came and the donors asked pointed questions about outcomes, evenings meant long nights of reading 20 years of grants and listening to stories from people who had nothing to cushion the blunt instruments life sometimes is. I went on site visit shelters in Oakland, after-school programs in San Jose, housing projects in the Valley. I sat in folding chairs while mothers told me how they escaped abuse with only their children and garbage bags for clothes. I listened to teenagers explain how a place to do homework kept them out of the streets. Each person's story was a small hammer that reshaped me. Seraphine would not accept the sentimentalist. She would say, "We don't give fish. We don't hand out fishing rods. We buy the damn river and guarantee the source." She enrolled me in an executive program for nonprofit leaders, sent me to seminars, had me rewriting grant applications until she actually bled corrections across my drafts. She made me defend every word in front of a board that expected clarity in numbers to match compassion. There were nights I fell asleep with my head on a spreadsheet. There were mornings when I cried in the shower because the imposter sensation clawed its way back. But each time I wanted to quit, I went back to the image of myself on the bench. The coat wrapped over another body, and I kept going. The work did not soothe my scar overnight, but slowly it taught me to call the scar a map rather than a wound. By the time summer leaned into its long afternoons, Seraphine called me to the library. I walked in expecting long lectures. Instead, she stood, folded her hands, and slid a single folder across the heavy table. Inside was an employment agreement, president and CEO of the Bellamy Foundation, a base salary that made my head swim, equity in the endowment, authority to steer programs after a transition period, full fiduciary duty, and the sort of mandate that meant she trusted me to make hard choices. "I didn't bring you here because you gave away a coat," she told me. "Anyone can be generous for 5 minutes if there might be a camera around. I watched you for months. I saw you stand up for a shelter that bankers wanted to defund because the returns were messy. I saw you sit in basements until midnight with teens who had nowhere to go. I saw you rewrite a policy because it might have left transgender youth without a bed." Something in her voice cracked once, the sound of an old sorrow finding company. "You have the brain to run this foundation, and you have the heart I lost." She would stay on the board to keep the entrenched old guard steady. Day to day, the river would run through me. I signed the papers with hands that shook. And that night, we uncorked something that had been preserved for years and watched the last light fall behind trees that looked as if they had been planted to keep secrets. Months passed. The foundation's projects multiplied. The most important one, the one that became my obsession, was a campus the city had reluctantly allowed us to build. 200 units of supportive permanent housing, on-site medical care, a job training center, a preschool, and a roof garden that smelled of rosemary and sun. The policy at its heart was simple and radical. No one would be turned away for lack of paperwork. Then, one late October afternoon, as the fog had come back heavy over the bay and the world smelled like wet leaves, my office door buzzed and June appeared with an odd look. "Your sister and Dorian are downstairs. They want to see you." "No appointment?" I felt a hollow echo that carried teenage memories of borrowed clothes returned with holes. I told security to send them up. They entered with faces rehearsed for contrition. Vera plain in a V-sheath and almost nothing on her hand, but a faint gleam where the ring had been. Dorian in a suit that looked borrowed from a newer man's cowardice. Their apologies came soft and tidy. Vera said she'd been awful. She said she was sorry for the live video, for the laughter, for the way she'd acted when I had no defense. Dorian said he wanted to make things right. Then Vera said the words that should have had no purchase in my life except, apparently, they now did. "Dad's in trouble. Investments went bad. We need help. 2 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and small and absurd. I asked for facts. They told me about crypto bets and angel stakes and flashy purchases. I had a folder June had placed on my desk, a tidy little thing that contained screenshots, bank statements, and an article about a family that had put everything into a mania of speculation. 87% gone in 11 months, I read aloud. "It's only a bridge," Dorian said in the tone of someone who believed life was a series of short-term loans you could fix with charm. "You're big now, Myra. 2 million won't even be noticed." Blood is blood? I stood and breathed. The foundation I had sworn to run existed to lift up the people who had been failed by circumstances, systems, and sometimes by cruelty. It did not exist to fund indulgence and negligence. "No," I said. I told them the foundation would not be a bailout for the reckless. Vera's eyes caught fire first with indignation. "You're enjoying this," she said. "You want us to suffer." I had, in my office, the power to hand them money and close the chapter of humiliation for them. I also had the responsibility to the thousands of people whose rent checks and children's meals were affected by my choices. I chose responsibility. Guards escorted them out. When they hit the lobby, the press and gossip accounts had already materialized. Someone had tipped them off. Vera wept and performed like someone who'd practiced sweeping in a mirror, then whipped out her phone and streamed accusations that gained 10 million views before lunch. She painted me as a heartless villain. The internet did what the internet always does when a soap opera arrives. It dug up everything. Old yearbook photos and stories of me being the girl who used to be locked out in the rain. The public sympathy for the family cracked like thin ice under a weight. Dorian's pitch deck leaked. Vera's followers shrank. The wedding vanity vanished in the space of a retweet. The day cooled into a cold justice of consequence that felt less satisfying, and more like a shower of stones. Then the hammer came down. Their investment advisors firm collapsed an enormous Ponzi scheme. The FBI executed search warrants. Banks foreclosed on the house. The mansion went to auction and sat empty because no bidder wanted to buy a life made up of reckless trust and poor affidavits. They moved into a second-floor apartment above a nail salon. It cost them what they had. They were stripped of the armor reality had provided. A few weeks later, they came to me again, ragged and asking for help in a way that suggested hunger rather than entitlement. They wanted money. They wanted to be rescued. This time I offered them what the foundation offered anyone who came through our doors, real tools to rebuild. I placed 3 business cards on the table, one for a financial planner who specialized in post-bankruptcy recovery, one for a debt management and literacy program we funded at a community center, and one for mental health and crisis resources. "This is what we do for strangers," I said quietly. "We help them find the ladder out." My father's hand went to the cards and froze. That's it? He asked, wounded and confused, as if I had given him a cup of water and he expected a fountain. After 32 years, that's all you have for your own father? I stood up. You made choices, Dad, I said. You amended a trust. You took risks that were not ours to cover. That's on you. My voice was steady because the cold had forged it into a thing that did not tremble on command. They left with information and no check. The elevator closed with an audible, final clunk. I watched the rain run down the windows and thought about doors how. Some closed forever and some open when you least expect it. The ache in my chest was not healed, but it was no longer raw. There was space where the wound had been. When opening day for the housing campus rolled around, the sky over the city looked like metal polished for a ceremony. 4 stories of glass and wood framed a courtyard where rosemary and kale grew in tidy beds, and children chased each other between planters like wind had been domesticated. 3,000 people packed the plaza. There were donors, city officials, families who would live in those units, and more press than I liked. I stood backstage in a plain black suit, my heart thumping so hard it felt like an instrument being tuned. Seraphine, in a white coat that was both armor and invitation, gave me a small nod. June squeezed my hand. I stepped up to the microphone and felt the weight of it like an object that would not be denied. I spoke in a voice that had learned the lesson of being heard. 1 year ago tonight, I said, I was standing on a step with a suitcase and nowhere to go. I had been cast out by the people I thought would catch me. A murmur moved through the crowd. I told them what I had learned on that park bench. That family is not always blood. Sometimes it is the stranger who wraps their warmth around you and walks away. I told them about the woman with bare feet and quiet eyes, who taught me about being human when the world tried to teach me how to survive. I gestured to the building behind me and named the mission plainly. This is a place where no one is turned away because their papers are incomplete. Where children will have a stable place to do homework. Where adults can pick up skills and dignity in equal measure. Near the back of the crowd. By a thick column, I saw my parents and Vera. They looked small without the threads of luxury. My father's coat was a faded thing that hung loose. My mother clutched a paper cup as if it might sell for something. Vera, hair cut short, looked frailer without the armor of labels. I did not glare. I did not gloat. I held their gaze for a heartbeat that stretched like elastic. Then I stepped away from the microphone. The ribbon was cut. Cameras flashed. Children ran forward with flowers, and life ordinary, stubborn. Messy life poured into the new building dot when I walked through the main doors. With the doors closing soft and decisive behind me, I felt a liberty I had never been given in the house of my birth. Forgiveness, I understood, is not always an opening you hand to others. Sometimes it is the choice to walk through another door because you deserve warmth and safety. Inside, a boy wearing a Spider-Man jacket tugged on my sleeve and asked if I had built the place. I knelt so we were at eye level. I helped, I said. He handed me a dandelion he picked in the courtyard, a small gift. A tiny rebellion against the hard facts of the world. For you? He asked shy. For me and for a lot of other people, I said. I took the dandelion and, for the first time in a long time, my smile felt like something true. Outside, the celebration continued. Inside, a new kind of work began, work that would not be solved by a ribbon or a speech, but by the daily, loving, boring grind of case management, job placement programs, early literacy classes. And neighborhood dinners where strangers became neighbors and neighbors became family. The woman who had stood barefoot on the bench never returned to my life as a regular fixture. Seraphine, elegant and enigmatic, would remain a mentor and a friend. June would continue to be the backbone who made the engine of aid run smoothly. But the most important thing that had changed was the map in my hands. A map that now included routes for other people who had been thrown into the cold. People asked me later if I ever regretted not taking the check when my parents needed it. They imagined a kinship bound by blood and cash. I told them the truth, which is more complicated. I felt pity for the small things they lost: a home, ease, the way they were judged by strangers on the internet, but I felt no obligation to make myself small again, so that they might rest in the heat of my work. I had been given something that could not be bought back, the knowledge that I can use resources to change outcomes for people who had been forced into corners they did not choose. Sometimes, if I close my eyes, I can still see the bench and the fog, and the woman's hands gripping mine. I can feel the roughness of that night and the unbelievable softness of the hand that offered help when I had none to offer. It anchors me. It is a story I tell when I'm tired and need to find direction. It is a story I tell to people who come to our doors on the worst nights of their lives. I do not know the future for my sister or my parents. I do know that when people are hurt by their own choices, the first thing they must learn is to reach out then to do the work to change. The foundation offers that ladder, but it cannot climb for them. We will give them the tools, the knowledge, the dignity to build sections of life anew. If they choose to take them, then we are ready. If they don't, we will still do the work we were given to do, to build rivers, to buy sources, to feed communities so people can drink for generations. Sometimes, I am asked if I ever blame Seraphine for finding me like fortune playing a trick. But I don't. I thank whatever thread wove our 2 nights together. I thank the woman I warmed, though I never learned her name. I thank the boots I no longer had to wear because they brought me to a place where I could trade an old humiliation for purpose. The story that began with a suitcase on a marble step didn't end with a mansion or with revenge. It ended with a lot of work. Stubborn and relentless, and with a lot of small, brilliant moments. Children learning to read. Parents taking the courses that teach them how to budget and hold a job. A courtyard full of rosemary where dinner is shared and no one feels like an outsider. The building is not an answer to everything, but it is a hinge. Through the doors of that campus, people walk into lives that are possible. If the lesson is simple, it is this. Sometimes the cold night is not the end. Sometimes it is the place where you find the person who will hand you a coat and then, years later, give you the keys to a house you will use to open doors for others. The rest of it is the work we do between those doors, the appointments, the calls, the hard decisions where we choose to be true to the people we serve, rather than to be kind to those who gambled away their safety. That's where dignity grows slow, stubborn, real. And when someone asks me now where I'm from, I see small things first, a city of coffee and fog. But then I had the campus we opened, the courtyard where the rosemary grows. And sometimes, if they are patient, I tell them about the woman whose name I never learned, and the night she taught me what it means to hand something away so someone else can live. We built more than housing. We built a protocol against disposability. We built a community. We built a story that begins with loss and folds itself into something larger, a map that other people can follow. Maybe one day someone else will sit on a bench in the fog and give away the only thing that keeps them warm. And maybe someone with soft eyes and a string of pearls will be watching to see what happens next. Maybe the world will surprise us again.